Hello, it's Scott Manley here. It is Saturday, October 12th. We are looking forward to a very exciting Sunday, October 13th. But right now it is time for another batch of deep space updates, and we have to rewind to September 24th when the Geelong 3 rocket launched from Dongfang Hang Tiangong, which basically means a platform in the South China Sea. This launched a set of payloads into sun-synchronous orbits. I think it was like 8 different satellites. 3 of them were from Xinjiang. There are Earth observation satellites. There was also Tianyu 441, Fudan 1, and a whole bunch of others, most of which I know nothing about. Also on 24th of September, there was a Kinetica 1 launch from Jiuquan, again in China, also into sun-synchronous orbit. This was a Jilin synthetic aperture radar satellite. Also the AirSat, or Zhongqi 1 and 2 were launched. Yunyao 21 to 22 meteorology satellites. 25th of September, Falcon 9 launched from Vandenberg Space Force Base, carrying 20 Starlink satellites, part of Group 9-8. 26th of September, over in Japan, we had H2A, the 202. That is the one with a pair of solid rocket boosters rather than more. This launched the IGS Radar 8 satellite into sun-synchronous orbit. So IGS stands for Information Gathering Satellite. It is Japan's government/military reconnaissance Earth observation satellites. And you know what? This is the second to last launch of the H2A rocket. 27th of September, Long March 2D launched from Jiuquan, carrying the Shijian 19 spacecraft into low Earth orbit. And this we do actually know a whole bunch about, because this was a test of a re-entry capable spacecraft, something that was going to do experiments in low Earth orbit for a couple of weeks and return. Now, I understand that those experiments include growing seeds, exposing them to radiation, that kind of thing. I know it had some international partners on it, including Thailand and Pakistan. And it just returned recently, landed out in the desert, and has since been returned. So this is, first time that China has done this as far as we know. 28th of September, we had Falcon 9 carrying Crew 9 at long last after multiple delays, largely stemming from Starliner's issues, but also from weather and other technical problems. So yeah, this was the first Dragon to launch from Slick 40. We've obviously been launching Falcon 9s from there for a while, but they, added the ability for crew to board from that there. Anyway, it only carried 2 crew members, of course, Nick Hague and Alexander Gorbanov, because the 2 seats are being kept spare so they can bring back Butch and Sonny from the International Space Station. And that's all very interesting, but perhaps the biggest deal was the fact that the second stage once again had problems with its engine. And after it performed its deorbit burn, or while it performed its deorbit burn, there was some technical issue with the Merlin, and the stage ended up falling outside of its intended disposal area. That's the second time this year they've had problems with a second stage engine on the Falcon 9. Now, they said they had fixed the previous one, but it looks like there may have been something related, unrelated, we're not sure, but it resulted in Falcon 9 being essentially grounded again because they couldn't put the second stage safely where it was supposed to. Now, that has since been lifted, but it did have some interesting knock-on effects. And that was followed on 4th of October by Vulcan Centaur in its second test flight. Now, this was originally supposed to carry Sierra Nevada's Dream Chaser, but that's still not ready to fly. Instead, they carried a mass simulator in the hopes that they would be able to show the Department of Defense that they are okay to carry DoD missions. And I'm not sure what the answer to that is, because about 20 seconds into the flight, we started to see some problems with one of the solid rocket motors. It sprouted a asymmetric flame, I guess, exhaust, and then very quickly there was an explosion, and the rocket visibly shifted in alignment as the thrust between those 2 solid rocket motors changed. So, despite that, Vulcan kept on going. Its guidance and navigation systems were able to make up for the problems, and it did indeed put the second stage into an orbit. And ultimately, the second stage was able to inject the payload into heliocentric orbit with masterful precision as far as we are concerned. But yeah, these solid rocket motors, clearly there's some questions to be asked about them. These are built by Northrop Grumman, Now we've had a whole bunch of testing on them with the Atlas V, but these are bigger ones, GEM 63 XLs. The nozzle is a ablative nozzle, and it's not the first time we've had one of these solid rocket motors from this company have a nozzle failure. Now, interestingly, the FAA didn't ground this. However, it does appear that this may be related to different licensing programs, that ULA's stuff is licensed under an old version, which was supposed to be less streamlined, the new version. I don't know what's going on there. But honestly, if I was the US Department of Defense, I would probably be a little suspicious until they figure out exactly why a solid rocket booster failed like that, even though Vulcan clearly showed that it is an amazing rocket and able to do all that stuff. Anyway, moving onwards. So, as I said, Falcon 9 had been grounded because of its second stage issue, but an exception was made for the Hera mission, which has a very limited launch window. One of the reasons why this was allowed to fly, even though Falcon 9 was grounded, was because the second stage was going to go into a heliocentric orbit. It wasn't going to return to Earth. So Hera is a follow-up mission to DART. If you remember, DART smashed into an asteroid Dimorphos, and changed its orbit by millimeters per second or whatever. Apparently, I figured out that it has shifted its orbit by something like 200 kilometers in the last 2 years. So Hera is going out to that. It's going to rendezvous with this asteroid in a couple of years. It's going to take a look at the big hole and see if anything can be gleaned by the differences in the layers of the asteroid. This mission also required a fair amount of performance from the Falcon 9, and they actually had to fully expend the booster 1061, after like 22 missions. So, good job there, and I really hope to see Hera, what Hera brings back in the future. Finally, 10th of October, we had a Long March 3B/E launching out of Xichang, carrying a satellite called Weishuang Hulwang. Look, it's a geostationary communications satellite, and I'm guessing that means it's commercial. Anyway, one mission that was also supposed to launch because of a limited window was the Europa Clipper mission, which was all encapsulated, ready to go on its Falcon Heavy, which is going to be fully expended. This is going to be sacrificing the entire rocket to the gods of Delta V. Unfortunately, they didn't want to sacrifice the rocket to Hurricane Milton, which flew through the region, and so it is now launching, I believe, on Monday. Also, in the last couple of weeks, Blue Origin were supposed to launch the new version, their New Shepard. It's just another version of the New Shepard, but it's a new booster. So, and a new capsule on top. It was ready to go. They had to end up scrubbing it, and apparently it's going to fly again tomorrow morning. And that'll be, of course, a test flight out of Texas. There's nobody on board. But I don't think anyone will watch this because, of course, tomorrow, Starship SuperHeavy IFT 5 is happening. That means it is hours away. We're going to get 2 launches and rocket landings out of Texas tomorrow morning. That's crazy. Now, sure, we'll talk more about this, but I think most people will watch Starship and SuperHeavy because it's bigger, it is more powerful, it has SpaceX written over it, it has much more excitement guaranteed upon the landing sequence. On the other hand, New Shepard does look a lot more like a penis, and that may be your thing. Moving onwards, if you remember, the Arianespace used to launch rockets, Soyuz rockets, out of Kourou in South America. And since the war in Ukraine broke out, that means that we haven't been seeing the Soyuz launching out of there. And that means that launch pad has been sitting like empty. So in the last couple of weeks, a French space agency, CNES, has selected a provider, a new company, to take up that launch pad, Maya Space. They're a startup that's backed basically by Arianespace, and they're supposed to be developing a small rocket that can be reusable. So their target for their launch vehicle is to be able to put 1,500 kilograms into sun-synchronous orbit in expendable mode, but they really want to demonstrate booster recovery and hopefully place 500 kilograms into the same orbit if they recover the booster. So Europe slowly making some steps in that direction. Talking about other small steps for man, giant leap for mankind, or at least for a nation. China's space agency unveiled their EVA suits for their lunar missions, which they are planning, 2030. So it's not clear exactly how capable this suit is, but it's very clear that China is very serious about putting humans on the moon. So it was demonstrated by their astronauts Wang Yiping and Zhang Ziyang. It looks like a lunar suit. There's a lot of different. I think it takes a lot of cues from their Phyton suits, which is again derived from the Orlan suits, which are Russian. But obviously, this needs to have legs that actually articulate and move. So, China now has a spacesuit. If this is actually an operational spacesuit, they now have a spacesuit which is more capable than what Russia has. Think about that. But yeah, they're talking about landing in 6 years, and at this point, it does look like there's a serious race between NASA potentially not getting back on time with the rate that everything else is going. And I say everything, Artemis, Starship, spacesuits, there's a lot of things that NASA and all the contractors need to sort out if they want to get to the moon before China. Now, on the space station, there was more talk about the slow leak that we have in the Zvezda module. This leak is apparently now being raised to the highest level of risk in the risk management system. So apparently earlier in the year, the leak has now grown to like 1.7 kilograms per day, which is, a couple of cubic meters of air. Now, they believe the leak is in the weld. They've done all sorts of repair attempts, but they've only managed to slow the leak rather than stop the leak altogether. And it's not known if this might develop into something more catastrophic. Now, the good news is it's in a vestibule between the main module and a spacecraft a spacecraft which is docked. So they can keep that hatch closed most of the time and only pressurize the section and only accept the leakage when they need access to that. But at some point they may have to close that off, and they would lose that docking port as a viable place to put cargo. Aerospace, they announced that they have a contract from the US Air Force Research Laboratory to investigate their Ghost spacecraft. This is a spacecraft which is essentially designed to sit in orbit. And when needed, they can push the button and it can re-enter and land and deliver cargo anywhere on the Earth. Well, obviously anywhere underneath its orbital track in as little as 90 minutes. So, they've been doing drop testing on this to verify that the aerodynamics are stable. It's like a it's like a box-shaped spacecraft with a heat shield that folds out like an umbrella. And so, yeah, they're actually got money to test this out. It'll be really interesting to see if they can actually turn this into a service. Vega C is returning to flight, finally, after 2 years since the big failure that grounded it. They've had 2 successful tests on the Zefiro 40 motor, and they've covered the entire performance envelope, and it sounds like the Arianespace is giving it the go. And now Europe is going to be back really in the game. It's got Ariane 6, it's going to have Vega C. It's now a real space agency again, right? Impulse Space, they've also had a great few weeks. They got a $35 million contract to support 2 US military space missions, right? So these are Victus Sergo and Victus Salo. So Victus Sergo is going to be the first test flight for the Helios kick stage. It's basically going to take a commercial remote sensing, I presume it's like an optical payload, up to geostationary orbit using this spacecraft. And the second one, they're going to carry some government payload designed by MIT to LEO. So so that's like actual potential real contract. But also in addition to this, they also signed on another a Series B funding round for another $150 million. So Impulse Space, looking good. It seems to be making all the right moves and getting some real wins out there. NASA has awarded a contract to Rocket Lab to study Mars sample return. Now, this is interesting because they had previously not been included in the list of companies that had been awarded funding to study this, but they were apparently reevaluated and have now been given a contract. So we didn't find out anything specifically about what might happen here, but it is interesting that Rocket Lab somehow seemed to turn things around and get another go at it. Also, Rocket Lab published the footage of their Archimedes engine test. It's now multiple different camera angles. It's hard to figure out if this is all from the same test firing or different test firing, but yeah, they have an engine that works. There's some green stuff in there. Presumably early on that could be T-tab. Later on it might be some, some engine that's disintegrating, and that's a problem that they will no doubt work around. But Archimedes is a real engine at this point. A company called Aetherflux announced that it has plans to develop a space-based solar power demonstrator, and unlike these visions that I had in my childhood of giant, kilometer-sized space solar panel stations out in geostation orbit, this is going to be a much more modest spacecraft in low Earth orbit, which is going to demonstrate beaming power down using infrared lasers or infrared beams. So they're hoping that from low Earth orbit, they will be able to focus a beam to a 10-meter spot and keep it on that as it passes across the sky. And, I don't know if space-based solar power in low Earth orbit is really much of a win, because you have so much of the time you're going to be spending in shadow. But all the same, yeah, interesting concept to start looking at infrared-based beamed power. SpaceX, so yeah, one of the big news in the last couple of weeks has been two major hurricanes that crashed through the southeast of the USA, Helene and Milton. And one of the interesting effects of this is that SpaceX got permission to turn on basic services for cell phones, direct to smartphone service from their Starlink network. Now, they've only got like 100 or so cellular enabled Starlink up right now, but with limited service, they should be able to provide some, plug some holes in the network, which has been seriously damaged by these storms that have come through. So yeah, first broad test of direct to cell phones has been happening, the last couple of weeks as a result of these major disasters. The US Space Force, their X-37B has been in this highly eccentric orbit for a few months. I honestly can't remember when it launched, but what I do remember is a few days ago they said, we're bringing it down. But we had a lot of questions about how it was going to come back from such a high energy orbit, because it uses a heat shield which is reusable, it's not ablative, and the heat fluxes would be way higher than anything the space shuttle ever saw. Well, now we know that they're going to perform successive aerobraking maneuvers. They're going to dip the spacecraft at perigee into the atmosphere, slow the spacecraft down, maybe modify the orbit in other ways. We don't know because they keep this stuff secret. But by doing this over multiple passes, they can slowly shed a lot of the energy and make the spacecraft, bring the spacecraft back into an envelope from which it can perform a complete return. I believe before this happens, it's also going to jettison the service module, because the service module is this thing that hangs off the back, and it's not going to be happy with re-entering, going through these aerobraking phases, because it'll generate so much heat. So that'll be something really interesting to watch. We don't know when this is going to happen, but it could be pretty cool, because I think it's still going to be in the northern hemisphere, and you might be able to see this passing through the atmosphere if they do it somewhere that's not over the ocean. And speaking of planes flying really fast, space planes, Dawn Aerospace showed off a really cool video of their little test vehicle flying, basically taking off and transitioning to a vertical climb, going straight up to 60,000 feet in 2 minutes with I think it's a hydrogen peroxide rocket. That's a pretty darn cool thing to watch. Now, this is a small, uncrewed aerial launch vehicle, and they're working to higher and higher altitudes right now. 60,000 feet in a couple of minutes is, pretty good to watch. It's also interesting, if you watch right towards the end, it's climbing more or less vertically, and then it rolls inverted so it can pull itself out and maintain positive G's during its transition to horizontal flight and then its descent. So it's sort of one of these things you start to appreciate when you're flying. Like, positive G's are good. You tend to want positive G's. Negative G's can be problematic. Anyway, look. Yes, the big news, which I will almost have to put into a separate video tomorrow morning, no doubt. Starship IFT Flight 5 has been approved. It's happening. And yeah, so this is going to be pretty much the same as IFT 4. It's going to be launching Starship into a suborbital test. It's going to be landing, I believe, in the Pacific Ocean this time. Or actually, maybe not. But it's going to be landing in the ocean, hopefully with more of a wing this time. But the real big difference that we've been waiting for is we're going to try a booster catch. We're going to see this thing, booster, come down, and potentially the chopsticks are going to come in, grab it, hold it, and hopefully nothing will explode. Now, according to some comment by Bill Gerst, there was the precision with which they landed the previous booster was 0.5 centimeter. I think that might be a mistake, but anyway, it might be 0.5 meter. But I'm presuming that they've managed to get their precision down enough if they're going to accept an attempt at a catch. Because if they get it wrong, there's fairly large consequences if they're more than a couple of meters out of position. But yeah, whatever happens, excitement is going to be guaranteed tomorrow. But just in case there's a little too much excitement, part of the license requires that SpaceX have a $500 million liability insurance policy. I don't know how that works. Maybe like Elon just writes a contract and says, sure, if something goes wrong, I'll pay $500 million. He could do that. But whatever happens, I'm going to be watching early morning tomorrow, hoping to see victory, hoping to see amazing things happen. And yeah, later I might get to watch Blue Origin's launch. I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.